In the quiet town of Willow Grove, Mississippi, in the year 2010, Lillian Walker lived in a modest, single-story house perched on the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to gravel paths winding into the countryside. At 40 years old, she carried herself with a deliberate calm, her movements measured, as if each step was a conscious effort to maintain the fragile order of her existence. Her days followed a predictable rhythm. She worked as an accountant at Willow Grove High School, her desk cluttered with neatly organized spreadsheets and budget reports. On Sundays, she attended the local Baptist church, slipping into the back pew to listen to sermons about redemption, her face a mask of quiet attention. Neighbors knew her as dependable, always ready to lend a hand, whether it was delivering a casserole to a grieving family or helping organize the annual town fair. Yet behind her composed exterior lay a secret so heavy it seemed to anchor her to the earth, tethering her to a past she could never fully escape. 10 years earlier, in the summer of 2000, Lillian's life had been a different kind of prison. Her marriage to James Walker had unraveled into a cycle of torment. James, once a skilled mechanic with a quick smile and a knack for fixing anything with an engine, had changed after losing his job at the auto shop. Whiskey became his solace, and with each bottle, his temper grew sharper, his hands quicker to lash out. Their small rented house on Maple Street had become a battleground, its walls absorbing shouted insults and the crash of thrown objects. Lillian had learned to navigate his moods, to shrink herself into silence when his eyes darkened with rage. But one humid August night, the air thick with the scent of rain, James crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He stumbled through the door, reeking of liquor, a kitchen knife clutched in his trembling hand. His voice slurred threats, accusing her of betrayals she hadn't committed. As he lunged, Lillian's survival instinct surged. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, its weight familiar from years of cooking, and swung it with a force born of desperation. The sickening crack of metal against bone echoed in the kitchen, and James crumpled to the linoleum floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Panic seized Lillian as she stood over his motionless body, the skillet slipping from her hands. Her mind raced, replaying the moment, searching for a way to undo it. But there was no undoing death. Her hands shook as she checked his pulse, finding nothing but stillness. The house was silent, save for the distant hum of cicadas outside. She sat on the floor for what felt like hours, staring at the man who had been her husband, her tormentor, now reduced to a lifeless heap. Fear of prison, of judgment, of the town's whispers drove her to act. She wrapped James's body in an old tarp from the garage, the plastic crinkling under her fingers as she worked in the dark. Her car, an aging sedan, waited in the driveway. She dragged the body to the trunk, her muscles straining under the weight, and drove into the night, the headlights cutting through the empty roads leading to the forest beyond Willow Grove. The forest was a place few ventured, a tangle of pine and oak stretching toward the horizon, its floor carpeted with fallen leaves and moss. Lillian chose a spot far from any trail, marked by an ancient maple tree whose gnarled branches seemed to guard the secrets of the earth. She dug with a shovel from the trunk, the blade biting into the soft soil, her breath ragged in the humid air. Sweat stung her eyes as she worked, the hole growing deeper with each scoop. When it was done, she rolled James's body into the grave, the tarp catching on roots as it fell. She covered him with earth, tamping it down until the ground looked undisturbed, blending seamlessly with the forest floor. By dawn, she was back home, scrubbing the kitchen floor until her hands were raw, erasing every trace of blood. The skillet went into a dumpster behind a gas station on the edge of town. She told herself it was over. The police came, as she knew they would. Sheriff Edwin Crow, a man with tired eyes and a slow drawl, knocked on her door 2 days later. James's absence had been noticed. His boss at the bar where he'd taken to drinking reported he hadn't shown up. Lillian played the part of the abandoned wife, her voice steady as she explained how James often disappeared for days, how he'd talked of leaving town. She wept just enough to seem convincing, her hands twisting a handkerchief as she spoke. The investigation was brief. Willow Grove was a small town, its resources limited, and James's reputation as a drifter with a temper made the story of his departure plausible. The case grew cold within months. the file relegated to a drawer in the sheriff's office. Lillian sold the house on Maple Street, unable to sleep in the room where she'd ended a life. She bought the new house on the outskirts, a place with no memories. Its pale blue walls a blank canvas for a new beginning. Yet freedom came at a cost. Lillian rebuilt her life with meticulous care, but the weight of her secret never lifted. She avoided mirrors, afraid to meet her own gaze, afraid of what she might see. A murderer, a woman who'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Her nights were restless, filled with dreams of James's face, his eyes accusing her from the darkness. She took to lighting a single candle each evening, placing it on the windowsill in the living room. It was a ritual she couldn't explain, not even to herself, perhaps a plea for forgiveness, perhaps a way to keep the shadows at bay. The flame flickered against the glass, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, a silent companion to her solitude. On this particular evening in 2010, Lillian sat in her armchair by the window, the candle burning low. The house was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the floorboards settling and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the worn fabric of her skirt. The town was settling into autumn, the air carrying the crisp promise of cooler days. She'd spent the day balancing the school's budget, her mind occupied with numbers, a refuge from memory. Now in the stillness, her thoughts drifted to James. Not the man he'd become, but the one she'd married, the one who'd once danced with her under the stars at a county fair. The memory stung, a reminder of how love had curdled into something unrecognizable. She rose to refill her tea, the kettle still warm on the stove, when a sound shattered the silence. A sharp knock at the front door. Her body tensed, the mug nearly slipping from her hands. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. The clock on the mantel showed 8:30, too late for neighbors or deliveries. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, each beat a warning she couldn't name. The knock came again, more insistent, echoing through the house like a summons. Lillian set the mug down, her steps slow as she crossed the room, the candle's flame wavering as if sensing her unease. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling, unaware that the past was about to step across her threshold. Lillian's hand lingered on the doorknob. Her breath caught in her throat as the door swung open to reveal a figure standing on the porch. Her heart stuttered, the world tilting beneath her feet. The man before her was James. Her James, the husband she had buried a decade ago. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his posture as familiar as the ache in her bones. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, a remnant of a bar fight from their early years, gleamed faintly in the porch light. His dark eyes held her gaze, carrying a depth she didn't recognize, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. His hair, once jet black, was streaked with silver at the temples, and fine lines etched the corners of his mouth, as if time had touched him in ways it shouldn't have. He stepped forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor of the entryway, and a smile curved his lips. A smile that belonged to a man coming home after a long day, not one rising from a grave. Lillian stood frozen, her body refusing to move as he brushed past her, his arm grazing hers with a warmth that sent a shiver down her spine. The air carried the scent of tobacco and cheap soap, the same smell that had clung to James's clothes after a day at the auto shop. Her mind reeled, clawing at the memory of that August night in 2000. The weight of the skillet in her hands, the crack of his skull, the blood pooling on the kitchen floor. She had dragged his body to the car, driven to the forest, dug a grave beneath the old maple. Every detail was seared into her, as vivid as the candle still burning on the windowsill behind her. Yet here he was, crossing her living room with the ease of someone who belonged, his fingers trailing over the spine of a book on the shelf, pausing to nudge a crooked curtain back into place. He moved as if the house were his own, as if the past 10 years had been a shared life rather than a chasm of absence. Lillian's legs felt unsteady, her vision narrowing to the sight of him settling into her space. He sank onto the couch, stretching his legs out, the worn leather creaking under his weight. His hands, calloused and familiar, rested on his knees, and he tilted his head, studying the room with a faint nod, as if approving of changes she'd never made for him. The house on Maple Street, where they'd lived together, was gone, sold to escape the ghosts of that night. This house, with its pale blue walls and sparse furnishings, was hers alone, a sanctuary built from the ashes of her guilt. Yet he seemed to know it, his gaze lingering on the small details, the chipped teacup on the coffee table, the quilt draped over the armchair, as if they were part of a history they'd written together. Lillian's thoughts spiraled, each one a jagged edge cutting through her certainty. She remembered wrapping his body in the tarp, the plastic slick with sweat and fear, as she hauled it to the trunk. She remembered the drive, the forest swallowing her headlights, the shovel sinking into the earth. The grave had been shallow, dug in haste, but she'd covered it well, erasing every trace. The police had found nothing, their questions fading into shrugs as they labeled James a runaway. She had rebuilt her life on that truth, fragile as it was. But this man, this impossible figure, unraveled it all. His presence was too solid, too real. The creak of the floorboards under his weight, the faint rustle of his jacket as he shifted. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice lodged in her throat, trapped by the terror that she was losing her mind. She sank into the armchair across from him, her hands gripping the armrests to anchor herself. Her eyes traced his features, searching for a flaw, a sign that this was a trick. The scar was exact, down to its slight curve. The way he sat, one leg crossed loosely over the other, mirrored James's old habits. Even the rhythm of his breathing, slow and steady, felt like an echo of nights she'd lain awake beside him, dreading his next outburst. But there was something different, something she couldn't place, a softness in his expression, a patience that James had never possessed. Her mind grasped at explanations. A doppelganger, a cruel prank, a hallucination born of guilt. She thought of the candle, its flame a nightly ritual to ward off her demons. Perhaps she'd summoned him, her sin given form to haunt her. He yawned, a gesture so ordinary it was jarring, and stretched out on the couch, his eyes fluttering closed. Lillian watched, her pulse hammering in her ears. He seemed at ease, as if sleep were a natural end to his return, not a defiance of death itself. She didn't move, her body rigid as she studied him in the dim light. The candle's glow cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines that marked his age. 10 years, she thought. 10 years since she'd ended his life. If this was James, where had he been? If he was alive, whose body lay beneath the maple? The questions gnawed at her, each one a thread pulling at the fabric of her reality. She considered running, to the sheriff, to a doctor, to anyone who could make sense of this. But the weight of her secret held her in place. To speak would be to confess, to risk everything she'd built. Hours passed, the candle burning down to a stub, its wax pooling on the sill. Lillian remained in the armchair, her eyes never leaving the man on her couch. His chest rose and fell, a steady rhythm that mocked her certainty. She thought of touching him, of pressing her fingers to his wrist to feel a pulse, but fear kept her still. What if he woke? What if he didn't? Her mind drifted to the forest, to the grave she'd dug with trembling hands. She saw herself standing over it, the earth cool against her skin, the maple's branches swaying in the night. The memory was too clear, too precise to be a lie. Yet the man before her was no ghost. His warmth, his weight, his scent were undeniable. As dawn crept through the windows, painting the room in soft gray, Lillian's exhaustion battled her fear. She hadn't slept, her body aching from the tension of the night. The man stirred, his eyes opening briefly before closing again, as if he sensed her gaze but chose to ignore it. She rose, her movement stiff, and crossed to the kitchen, needing distance, needing air. The kettle sat cold on the stove, a reminder of the moment before the knock. She filled it, her hands shaking, and set it to boil, the hiss of water grounding her in the present. But her thoughts circled back to him, to the impossibility of his presence. She wasn't mad. She couldn't be. Madness didn't breathe, didn't touch her books, didn't sleep on her couch. Yet if he was real, the truth of that night, the truth she'd carried for a decade, was a lie. And that was a weight she wasn't ready to bear. Lillian's nights had become sleepless vigils, her days a haze of dread that clung to her like damp air. The man she called James, The impossible figure who had stepped into her life remained in her house, his presence weaving itself into the fabric of her routine with a familiarity that unnerved her. Each morning she woke to the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen, the clink of a spoon against a mug as he stirred sugar into his cup, just as James had always done. 2 spoonfuls, no cream. He moved through her home with a quiet confidence, his hands finding tasks as if by instinct. He tightened the screws on a squeaky door hinge. The metallic groan silenced under his touch. He hummed fragments of old blues tunes, the same ones that had crackled through their radio on lazy Sunday afternoons a lifetime ago. The melodies stirred memories she had buried, moments when their marriage had still held flickers of warmth before whiskey and rage consumed it. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, cracks began to form in Lillian's perception of reality. She watched him closely, her eyes tracing his movements for any sign of deception, any hint that he was not what he seemed. His resemblance to James was uncanny, down to the way he scratched the back of his neck when distracted, or the slight limp in his left leg, a remnant of an old injury from his mechanic days. But there were gaps, silences that unsettled her. When she asked where he had been, what had kept him away, his answers were vague, slipping past her questions like water through fingers. He spoke of their old life as if it had never ended, referencing the house on Maple Street, long since sold, or dinners they'd shared that existed only in her memory. His words painted a world where the past decade hadn't happened, where the night of blood and earth had never occurred. Lillian's attempts to anchor herself in the present only deepened her unease. She checked the calendar pinned to the kitchen wall, its pages marked with appointments and reminders, all confirming it was 2010. She flipped through newspapers stacked by the door, their headlines shouting local events, a new mayor elected, a factory closing down, all dated to the current year. Her phone, a bulky device she barely used, displayed the same truth in its glowing screen. Yet he spoke of 2000 as if it were yesterday, his voice carrying a conviction that made her doubt her own senses. She began to wonder if time itself had fractured, trapping her in a limbo where the past refused to stay buried. Desperate for proof, Lillian tried to capture his image, hoping a photograph might tether him to reality or expose him as a mirage. She used her phone, snapping pictures when he wasn't looking, while he stood at the stove, flipping pancakes or sat on the porch, gazing at the horizon. But each time she checked the gallery, her stomach twisted. The images showed only blurs, indistinct smudges where his face and body should have been, as if the camera refused to acknowledge his existence. She tried again and again, adjusting the light, steadying her hands, but the results were the same. Empty spaces where he stood, surrounded by the sharp clarity of her home. The failure gnawed at her, feeding a growing fear that she was unraveling, her mind conjuring a ghost too vivid to dismiss. In a bid to ground herself, Lillian dug through a cardboard box stored in the attic, its contents a reliquary of her former life. She found their wedding photo, faded but intact, tucked between old letters and a tarnished bracelet. James's face stared back at her from the frame, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling under a summer sky. She studied the photo, comparing it to the man downstairs. The scar above his eyebrow, the curve of his jaw, the faint mole on the side of his neck, all matched perfectly. Her fingers traced the image, searching for a discrepancy, but there was none. The discovery should have reassured her, but instead it tightened the knot of panic in her chest. If he was James, how could he be here? If he wasn't, how could anyone know him so completely? Her fear sharpened when an unexpected visitor arrived. Sheriff Edwin Crow pulled into her driveway one afternoon, his patrol car kicking up dust along the gravel path. Lillian's pulse quickened as she opened the door to him, her mind flashing to the investigation a decade ago. His questions about James's disappearance, the way his eyes had lingered on her, searching for cracks in her story. He claimed he was there about a neighbor's complaint, a stray dog causing trouble. But his presence felt like a probe, his gaze too keen, too knowing. She invited him in, her hands smoothing her skirt to hide their trembling. As they stood in the living room, she realized the man she called James was nowhere to be seen. The kitchen was empty, the porch silent, the house holding its breath. She offered the sheriff coffee, stalling, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, expecting him to appear. But he didn't, and Crow left after a few minutes, his parting glance heavy with unspoken questions. The moment the sheriff's car disappeared down the road, James reappeared, stepping into the kitchen as if he'd never left. He carried a toolbox, claiming he'd been fixing a loose board in the shed, but Lillian hadn't heard a sound from outside. His sudden return, timed so precisely, sent a chill through her. She watched him pour a glass of water, his movements casual, but her mind raced. Had he hidden? Had he known Crow was coming? The questions piled up, each one a weight pressing against her fragile certainty. She felt her reality splintering, the edges of her world blurring like the photographs she couldn't capture. That night, as he slept on the couch again, Lillian sat in her armchair, the candle's flame flickering weakly. She resolved to find answers, to confront whatever, or whoever this man was, before the cracks in her mind swallowed her whole. Lillian's resolve hardened as the days blurred into a relentless cycle of doubt and dread, each moment in the presence of the man who called himself James eroding her grip on reality. The need for certainty consumed her, a gnawing hunger that drove her to act. She slipped out of the house one gray morning, her keys clutched tightly in her hand, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. The forest where she had buried James 10 years ago beckoned, its secrets hidden beneath layers of earth and time. She climbed into her sedan, the engine coughing to life, and drove toward the outskirts of Willow Grove, the town's familiar streets giving way to open fields, and then to the dense, shadowed expanse of pine and oak that swallowed the horizon. The road narrowed, pavement turning to dirt, and her tires crunched over gravel as she navigated by memory, her heart pounding with each mile that brought her closer to the truth. The forest had changed since that frantic night in 2000, its boundaries creeping outward, its paths reclaimed by undergrowth. Lillian parked at the edge of a clearing, the same spot where she had stopped a decade ago, though the landscape felt foreign now. The old maple tree, her only landmark, stood tall against the overcast sky, its gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. She stepped out of the car, her boots sinking into the damp earth, and slung a shovel over her shoulder, its blade glinting dully in the muted light. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and decay, a reminder of the grave she had dug under cover of darkness. She counted her steps from the maple, just as she had then, 30 paces north, 10 east, her breath shallow as she scanned the ground for signs of disturbance. But the forest had woven its own tapestry over the years, blanketing the earth with ferns and tangled roots, erasing any trace of her crime. When she reached the spot, Lillian paused, her eyes sweeping the area. The ground looked pristine, untouched by human hands. No sunken patches, no telltale ridges where soil might have settled over a body. The absence of evidence brought a fleeting relief, a whisper that perhaps the grave was still there, undisturbed, holding James's remains as it had for a decade. She dropped to her knees, her fingers brushing the earth, feeling its cool solidity. She didn't dare dig, not yet, afraid of what she might find or what she might not. The forest was silent, save for the rustle of leaves stirred by a faint breeze, and she sat back on her heels, the shovel resting beside her. The maple loomed above, its bark rough and unchanging, a witness to her secret. She tried to summon the memory of that night, the weight of the tarp, the strain of dragging his body, the ache in her arms as she shoveled dirt. But the image felt distant, overshadowed by the man now living in her house. Her relief curdled into fear as she considered the implications. If James's body was still here, beneath this undisturbed earth, then who was the man who brewed her coffee, who hummed her songs, who slept on her couch? The question gnawed at her, sharper than the guilt she'd carried for years. She rose, brushing soil from her hands, and retraced her steps to the car, the shovel heavier now, as if it carried the weight of her unanswered questions. The drive back to Willow Grove passed in a fog, her mind looping through possibilities. A twin she'd never known about, a stranger with an impossible likeness, a punishment crafted by her own fractured psyche. By the time she pulled into her driveway, dusk had settled over the town, the sky a bruise of purple and gray. She sat in the car for a moment, gathering herself, hoping the house would be empty, that the ordeal had ended like a fever breaking. But as she stepped through the front door, the scent of chamomile tea greeted her, warm and familiar. He was in the kitchen, pouring steaming liquid into 2 mugs, his movements as casual as if he'd been there all day. Lillian's stomach twisted, her earlier resolve faltering under the weight of his presence. He turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, he acknowledged her absence. He didn't ask where she'd been, but his gaze held a quiet certainty, as if he knew. He gestured to the table, inviting her to sit, but she remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. The tea sat untouched, its steam curling into the air, and she felt the room shrink around her, the walls pressing in with the suffocating truth she couldn't escape. Lillian's fear deepened as she noticed his stare, calm, almost knowing, with an edge that felt like accusation. She shook her head, denying the unspoken, her body rigid against the urge to flee. He didn't press, didn't pursue, but the weight of his look lingered, a silent challenge to her fragile defenses. She retreated to her bedroom, claiming exhaustion, and locked the door behind her, a futile gesture against a man who seemed to defy locks and logic. In the quiet, she rifled through her desk, pulling out old notebooks, receipts, anything that might prove her reality. But her efforts were in vain. Photos she'd taken of him were gone from her phone, replaced by blank screens or corrupted files. A video she tried to record showed only static, the sound distorted into an unintelligible hum. Her letters, her journals, held no mention of him, as if he existed only in the present, untethered to her documented past. The house, once her refuge, had become a trap, its familiar corners now hiding threats she couldn't name. Lillian sat on the edge of her bed, the shovel still leaning against the wall where she'd left it, a reminder of her fruitless search. The forest had offered no answers, only more questions, and the man downstairs seemed to hold the key to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Her sanctuary was no longer hers. It pulsed with the rhythm of his footsteps, his breath, his presence, all weaving a net around her past. She stared at the locked door, knowing it wouldn't keep him out, knowing that whatever he was, ghost, imposter, or something worse, he was here, and her reckoning was only beginning. Lillian's world had narrowed to a pinpoint, her existence reduced to the suffocating tension of the house and the man who occupied it. The uncertainty that had gnawed at her for days had grown unbearable, a weight that crushed her resolve until she could no longer endure the ambiguity. She decided to confront him, to demand the truth, whatever it might cost her. On a quiet evening, with the house bathed in the dim glow of a single lamp, she found him in the living room, seated in the armchair, where she had spent countless nights wrestling with her guilt. His posture was relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, his hands folded in his lap, but his eyes followed her with a stillness that set her nerves on edge. She stood before him, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and determination, her hands clenched into fists to steady herself. The air felt thick, charged with the inevitability of what was to come. He met her gaze without flinching, his face betraying no surprise, only a faint shift in expression, a coldness that crept into his smile, stripping away the warmth she had once mistaken for James's. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, and it stirred a flicker of recognition in her, a sense that the mask he wore was slipping. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the armrests, and began to unravel the truth. He was not James, but Nathan, James's younger brother, a figure so peripheral to her life that she had barely registered his existence. 10 years ago, Nathan had been a lanky teenager, living on the fringes of their world, his presence overshadowed by James's volatility. When James vanished, Nathan's suspicions had fallen on Lillian, though he had no proof, only a gut-deep certainty that she was hiding something. That certainty had become his obsession, a fire that burned through his youth and shaped his future. Nathan had spent a decade transforming himself, molding his body and mannerisms to mirror his brother's. He had studied James's walk, the slight tilt of his head when he laughed, the way he held a coffee mug with both hands. He had memorized the stories James told, the quirks that defined him, down to the way he always left one shoelace untied. To perfect the illusion, Nathan had gone further, subjecting himself to a surgical procedure to replicate the scar above James's eyebrow, a mark that had become a cornerstone of his disguise. He had tracked Lillian's life from a distance, piecing together her habits, her routines, her solitude. He had learned of her new house, her job at the school, the candle she lit each night, as if it were a beacon calling him to her. His preparation was meticulous, a tapestry woven from grief and vengeance, each thread a step toward the moment he now inhabited. With the help of Sheriff Edwin Crowe, a family friend who had never accepted the official story of James's disappearance, Nathan had crafted a plan to break Lillian. Crowe's lingering doubts about Lillian had made him a willing ally, though Nathan had kept him at arm's length, revealing only what was necessary. Nathan had slipped into Willow Grove undetected, moving through the town like a shadow. He had entered Lillian's house when she was at work, planting tiny devices, cameras hidden in the corners of rooms, software on her phone that corrupted images and videos. He had tampered with her reality, ensuring that every photograph she took of him dissolved into blurs, every recording warped into static. The illusion was designed to unravel her, to make her question her sanity until she could no longer cling to her secrets. Each act was a calculated strike, meant to push her toward confession. As Nathan spoke, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of pain, he revealed the depth of his loss. James had been flawed. His drinking, his temper, his cruelty had cast long shadows. But to Nathan, he was family, the only tether in a world that had offered little else. Growing up, Nathan had idolized his brother, clinging to the moments when James was kind, when he taught him to fix a carburetor or shared a quiet laugh over a campfire. James's disappearance had shattered Nathan, leaving him adrift, his life defined by the absence of the one person who had mattered. The official story, that James had abandoned his life, walked away without a word, had never rung true. Nathan had seen the way Lillian avoided questions, the way her eyes darted when James's name came up. He had vowed to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter what it demanded of him. Lillian listened, her body rooted to the floor, her breath shallow as Nathan's words stripped away the layers of her deception. The room seemed to close in, the lamp's light casting harsh shadows across his face, a face that was both James and not James, a cruel mimicry of the man she had killed. Her mind flashed to that night, the skillet, the blood, the forest, but the memory felt distant now, overshadowed by the reality of Nathan's presence. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the possibility that she was mad, that this was a hallucination, but his clarity, his precision, left no room for doubt. He knew too much, saw too much, and his knowledge was a mirror reflecting her guilt. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Crowe stepped into the room, his silhouette filling the doorway. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on Lillian, with the same suspicion that had haunted her a decade ago. Nathan had summoned him, the final piece of his plan falling into place. Crowe's presence was a silent accusation, his badge glinting in the lamplight, a symbol of the justice she had evaded for so long. Lillian's strength faltered, her knees buckling as she sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. The weight of their combined scrutiny was too much, a tide that swept away her defenses. She felt the truth rising within her, unstoppable, a confession she could no longer contain. Her voice broke as she admitted what she had done, the words spilling out in a rush. She described the night she had killed James, the argument that had spiraled into violence, the skillet that had ended it all. She recounted the panic, the drive to the forest, the shallow grave beneath the maple. Each detail was a release, a shedding of the burden she had carried, though it brought no relief, only a hollow ache. Nathan stood motionless, his eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. Crowe shifted, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt, but he didn't move, letting her words fill the room. Lillian's confession hung in the air, a final act that bound them all, accuser, accused, and witness, in a moment of raw, unyielding truth. Lillian's confession had drained the room of its tension, leaving only a heavy silence as Sheriff Crowe stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs punctuating the moment. Her wrists felt the cold bite of steel, her body yielding to the inevitable as he guided her toward the door. Her steps were mechanical, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the man who had undone her. Nathan stood still, his gaze following her departure, the photograph of James clutched in his hand, its edges worn from years of handling. The door closed behind her, the sound echoing through the house, and Nathan was alone, the weight of his victory settling over him like dust. He sank into the armchair, the lamp casting a dim circle of light that barely reached the corners of the room. The house, once Lillian's sanctuary, now felt like a hollow shell, its walls absorbing the truth but offering no comfort. Nathan's fingers traced the photograph, James's face frozen in a moment of unguarded joy, a rare smile from a day long before the darkness had claimed him. The image was a relic of the brother Nathan had loved, the brother whose flaws had been overshadowed by the bond they shared. For 10 years, Nathan had poured himself into this mission, reshaping his body, his voice, his very identity to become a mirror of James. He had sacrificed everything, friendships that had withered in his absence, dreams of a life beyond Willow Grove, the chance to be anyone other than the avenger of his brother's death. The scar above his eyebrow, surgically crafted to match James's, throbbed faintly, a reminder of the lengths he had gone to. He had tampered with her reality, ensuring that every photograph she took of him dissolved into blurs, every recording warped into static. The illusion was designed to unravel her, to make her question her sanity until she could no longer cling to her secrets. Each act was a calculated strike, meant to push her toward confession. As Nathan spoke, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of pain, he revealed the depth of his loss. James had been flawed. His drinking, his temper, his cruelty had cast long shadows. But to Nathan, he was family, the only tether in a world that had offered little else. Growing up, Nathan had idolized his brother, clinging to the moments when James was kind, when he taught him to fix a carburetor or shared a quiet laugh over a campfire. James's disappearance had shattered Nathan, leaving him adrift, his life defined by the absence of the one person who had mattered. The official story, that James had abandoned his life, walked away without a word, had never rung true. Nathan had seen the way Lillian avoided questions, the way her eyes darted when James's name came up. He had vowed to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter what it demanded of him. Lillian listened, her body rooted to the floor, her breath shallow as Nathan's words stripped away the layers of her deception. The room seemed to close in, the lamp's light casting harsh shadows across his face, a face that was both James and not James, a cruel mimicry of the man she had killed. Her mind flashed to that night, the skillet, the blood, the forest, but the memory felt distant now, overshadowed by the reality of Nathan's presence. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the possibility that she was mad, that this was a hallucination, but his clarity, his precision, left no room for doubt. He knew too much, saw too much, and his knowledge was a mirror reflecting her guilt. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Crow stepped into the room, his silhouette filling the doorway. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on Lillian, with the same suspicion that had haunted her a decade ago. Nathan had summoned him, the final piece of his plan falling into place. Crow's presence was a silent accusation, his badge glinting in the lamplight, a symbol of the justice she had evaded for so long. Lillian's strength faltered, her knees buckling as she sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. The weight of their combined scrutiny was too much, a tide that swept away her defenses. She felt the truth rising within her, unstoppable, a confession she could no longer contain. Her voice broke as she admitted what she had done, the words spilling out in a rush. She described the night she had killed James, the argument that had spiraled into violence, the skillet that had ended it all. She recounted the panic, the drive to the forest, the shallow grave beneath the maple. Each detail was a release, a shedding of the burden she had carried, though it brought no relief, only a hollow ache. Nathan stood motionless, his eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. Crow shifted, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt, but he didn't move, letting her words fill the room. Lillian's confession hung in the air, A final act that bound them all, accuser, accused, and witness, in a moment of raw, unyielding truth. Lillian's confession had drained the room of its tension, leaving only a heavy silence as Sheriff Crow stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs punctuating the moment. Her wrists felt the cold bite of steel, her body yielding to the inevitable as he guided her toward the door. Her steps were mechanical, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the man who had undone her. Nathan stood still, his gaze following her departure, the photograph of James clutched in his hand, its edges worn from years of handling. The door closed behind her, the sound echoing through the house, and Nathan was alone, the weight of his victory settling over him like dust. He sank into the armchair, the lamp casting a dim circle of light that barely reached the corners of the room. The house, once Lillian's sanctuary, now felt like a hollow shell, its walls absorbing the truth but offering no comfort. Nathan's fingers traced the photograph, James's face frozen in a moment of unguarded joy, a rare smile from a day long before the darkness had claimed him. The image was a relic of the brother Nathan had loved, the brother whose flaws had been overshadowed by the bond they shared. For 10 years, Nathan had poured himself into this mission, reshaping his body, his voice, his very identity to become a mirror of James. He had sacrificed everything, friendships that had withered in his absence, dreams of a life beyond Willow Grove, the chance to be anyone other than the avenger of his brother's death. The scar above his eyebrow, surgically crafted to match James's, throbbed faintly, a reminder of the lengths he had gone to. He had thought justice would bring peace, that exposing Lillian's crime would mend the fracture in his soul. But as he sat in her empty house, he felt only a vast, aching void, a hollowness that no confession could fill. The night stretched on, and Nathan remained in the armchair, the photograph resting on his knee. He thought of the years spent planning, the nights hunched over grainy photos, memorizing James's mannerisms, the months learning to mimic his laugh, his gait, his habits. He had haunted Lillian's life from afar, tracking her moves, waiting for the moment to strike. The devices he had planted in her home, the corrupted images, the warped recordings, all had been tools to unravel her, to strip away her defenses until she broke. He had succeeded, but the triumph was ash in his mouth. His reflection in the darkened window caught his eye, and he saw not himself, but James, or the version of James he had become. The face was no longer his own, altered by surgery and obsession, a mask he could never fully remove. He wondered who he was now, what remained of Nathan beneath the layers of vengeance. Morning came, gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Nathan rose, his body stiff from the sleepless night, and drove to the police station, the photograph tucked into his jacket pocket. The town was waking slowly, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, school buses rumbling down the streets. He parked outside the squat brick building, its faded sign proclaiming Willow Grove Sheriff's Office, and stepped inside. The air smelled of coffee and old paper, a familiar scent from the days he had spent pleading with Crow to reopen James's case. The sheriff was waiting in his office, his desk cluttered with files, his face etched with a weary understanding. Nathan sat across from him, his hands folded, and gave his statement, recounting the plan, the deception, the confession. Crow listened, his pen scratching notes, his eyes occasionally meeting Nathan's with a flicker of pity. He saw what Nathan could not say, that the man before him was a shell, hollowed out by his own crusade. When the formalities ended, Nathan left the station, the photograph still in his pocket, a tether to a past he couldn't release. He wandered the streets of Willow Grove, his boots scuffing against the pavement, the town unfolding around him like a memory. He passed the diner where James had once bought him milkshakes, the garage where his brother had worked, the church where their mother's funeral had been held. Each landmark was a stitch in the fabric of his loss, a reminder of the life he had abandoned to pursue this end. He considered leaving, driving away to a place where no one knew his name, but the thought felt empty. Willow Grove was all he had left, its streets a map of his grief. He decided to stay, not as Nathan, but as a ghost of himself, a man without a name, living in the shadow of his brother's memory. He returned to his small apartment, a rented room above a hardware store, and placed the photograph in a drawer, its weight too much to bear. He stepped outside, the first autumn leaves drifting to the ground, their rustle a soft lament. The truth had freed him from his mission, but it had left him with nothing to replace it, no purpose, no path forward. Across town, Lillian sat in a holding cell, her back against the cold concrete wall, her eyes fixed on a narrow window high above. The candle she had lit each night for a decade remained unlit, its absence a marker of her exposed guilt. She felt no regret, no sorrow for James, only a bone-deep fatigue, the exhaustion of a woman whose life had collapsed under the weight of one irreversible act. The cell was quiet, the world outside moving on without her, and she let herself sink into the stillness. Her story ended, her secrets laid bare.